Okay, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for joining our Yom Iyun, Chodesh Tov to everybody. Okay, so part of what I was looking to do was to talk about food and eating, because this is leading to some people going and joining Deborah for a special food demo, and for other people just for eating. But the other reason is, right, exactly. But the other reason why I wanted to talk about eating is because there's an aspect of Pesach. I know we're just about near Shavuot, but I'm going to talk about Pesach for a second because it goes with Shavuot. There's an aspect of Pesach that has always like really intrigued me, which is that if you think about it conceptually, we treat chametz, Pesach, like shrimp or pork. I mean, the way it and the halachot about it, it's like all of a sudden something that, well, a lot of us eat every day. I try not to eat it every day, but what the mainstays of our existence as people on this earth is to eat bread. Okay, sorry for the keto people, but it's to eat bread, right? And then it's something that's just basic. Bread is like the most basic food that you ever eat, and then all of a sudden you're meant to switch it, and you think of it as something disgusting. Like, God forbid you should see a piece of bread. Like, I don't know who has slices of bread just hanging around in their closet that are found on Pesach, but God forbid you should see some sort of chametz on Pesach. And it's just, like you go on a camping trip, and the picnic table that you happily eat on anytime you're camping, anytime during the year, all of a sudden you look at it with disgust, as though someone has wiped pork all over it, and you have to cover it 3 times, and it brings all this. It just makes you really puts you in the framework of something that's treif of treif. And then all of a sudden Pesach is done, and it's like you flip the switch back, and there's nothing wrong with it, and all of a sudden you can't believe you ate matzah. It's just an unbelievable conceptual switch that we make. And lots of people have talked about why chametz is, what is wrong with chametz? Like, why is it so utterly forbidden on Pesach? And I think Rabbi Harris had referred to Sefer HaChinuch. I think Sefer HaChinuch is just such a great sefer because it consolidates a lot of thinking. As Rabbi Harris mentioned, nobody knows, it's unattributed medieval work. It's based on Rambam's Sefer HaMitzvot, where Rambam counts all of the 613 mitzvot. It's not the only Sefer HaMitzvot that we have, but Sefer HaChinuch bases his analysis of the parshiot and the mitzvot on Rambam. But one thing to remember about Sefer HaMitzvot is, presumably, he writes this in the introduction, he writes it to keep his kid off the soccer field on Shabbat, right? So he's taking Maimonidean ideas and making them engaging enough and relatable enough to his kid, so his kid won't always run off on Shabbat and play with his friends, but also come in and actually think about something important about the Parsha. So he consolidates a lot of thinking about chametz, and this is the second source. בעוד שמעתי טעם באיסור שעור ודבש, לפי השעור מגביה עצמו, וכן הדבש מעלה רתיחתו הרבה, ולכן נתרחקו לרמוז כי תועבת השם כל גבה לב. And he's referring not to Pesach, but to korbanot in general. He says, and I further heard a reason about the prohibition of leaven and honey, because leaven raises itself, and honey likewise brings up much foam. So for all the molecular gastronomy people, you can make foam with honey, apparently. And therefore, they were distanced from us to hint that an abomination to the Lord is every haughty person. So according to Sefer HaChinuch, what's the problem with chametz? What is chametz resemble? What is the metaphor?
The ego.
The ego, exactly. Chametz makes you haughty. And what are we doing on Pesach? We're trying to take away that kind of haughtiness. We're trying to clean out our system and our environment from that haughtiness, and to come to God, to come to this idea of leaving Egypt in a very simplified version, right? And the most tahor that we can be, the most pure that we can be. Now, Sefer HaChinuch raises this idea not about Pesach, but about korbanot, because there's actually a really interesting about korbanot, which is that the way that we freak out about chametz, like 8 days, whatever it is, 7 days, whatever it is, a year, that was the tenor of how the Kohanim related to the Mizbeach, related to the altar, related to the sanctuary in the Beit HaMikdash. It also had to be chametz free, if you can imagine. It had to be chametz free. You could not bring a korban with any kind of chametz, and it turns out with any honey as well. Because when you brought a korban, how are you supposed to bring a korban according to Sefer HaChinuch? And what kind of mentality are you supposed to have? Humble. You're supposed to be humble. You're coming and you're serving God with this korban. What is the root of korban? Karov. You're trying to get close to God. How do you get close to God? By leaving your ego to the side. So there's an isur. There's a prohibition. Thank you. There's a prohibition against bringing any of that chametz, bringing any of that kind of leavening into the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, except if we read, and some of you will start to sing it, if we read the first source from Dvarim, we actually see something very different. And there are sources right here now. We see something very different when it comes to Shavuot. Usfartem lechem miupat haShabbat miyom haviachem et omer hatnufa sheva Shabbatot tmimim tiana. Okay, you're supposed to. This is about counting the Omer. This is about bringing the Omer to the Beit HaMikdash. You bring it every day from the day after Shabbat. Okay, we'll talk about that in a moment. From the day after Shabbat, you should count off 7 weeks. They must be complete. You must count until the day after the 7th week. So what is the day after the 7th week? That's 50 days, right? The Omer is 49 days. The day after is the 50th day. And what is that day? Shavuot, right? And then what does it say? And you will bring a new mincha. A mincha was a korban it was not brought onto the altar, but it was a wheat-based korban. Every other time during the year, it should not have, except for one other issue, but we won't get to that. But every other time of the year, what is in it? It's chametz free, right? It's a chametz free mincha offering. Except today on Shavuot, you're going to bring something different. Mimashvotechem taviu lechem tnufa shtaim shnei esronim sola tiena chametz tafiena bikurim ladonai. You shall bring from your settlements 2 loaves of bread as an elevation offering. So that means like you're waving it. Each shall be made of 2/10 of a measure of choice flour, baked after leavening as fruits of God. Okay, so we have that reference to the bikurim, which we associate with Shavuot. And what are we bringing with the Shavuot offering? Chametz. This thing that is supposed to be completely like the Beit HaMikdash is supposed to be free of this, the Mizbeach. This doesn't go on the Mizbeach, but the chametz can never touch the Mizbeach. And here you have this idea in Pesach of purity that resembles the Beit HaMikdash. The purity of Pesach, of leaving chametz behind and getting rid of all of that leavening. All of a sudden on Shavuot, this is the mincha chadashah. This is the new mincha. So how do we get from matzah, how do we get from no chametz, from this prohibition, to glorifying chametz just 50 days later, just 50 days after Pesach? And so the other thing I want to just mention, we often, in terms of looking at the Jewish calendar, we like to balance things, right? So Sukkot is often, seen as a balance to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Shmini Atzeret is a balance to Sukkot. And so Shavuot, and of course the Torah does this as well, Pesach and Shavuot are interchangeably linked. How do we count the Omer? We count it from Pesach, okay? We count it down from Pesach. Or we count it up. If we look at it Kabbalistically, we count it up from Pesach. And so we have this balance between Pesach and Shavuot. And so all of a sudden you start with matzah, and that's supposed to be complete purification, and you end with chametz. How do you go up and then end with chametz if we're told that chametz is a reflection of impurity? And to add to the confusion and to add to the question, what do we celebrate on Shavuot? What are we celebrating on Shavuot? Matan Torah. Now, right? What are we celebrating?
I said harvest.
Well, your answer fits perfectly with this, right? Because if you are celebrating the harvest, then you should be celebrating all the good things that can come out of the harvest. So that fits very nicely. But then we have this added element where the rabbis have associated Shavuot with the giving of the Torah based on their calculations of leaving Egypt, right? And that's a whole other story. But if you're talking about us receiving the Torah, shouldn't it be Dafka then that we should be getting rid of Chametz, right? If the Torah is the gift of God, the revelation of God, then shouldn't we be coming without any of that added? If we just said that Chametz something is in some element impure, and we purify ourselves for Pesach, shouldn't we be doing that with Shavuot as well? And so it's a strange idea that we're actually glorifying Chametz as the antidote in some ways to Pesach. So that's where we're starting from, this kind of question. And there's actually a series of lectures on the Har Etzion website by Rav Uriel Etam, where he goes through a lot of shurim that he's written. He gives them in Hebrew, and someone has transcribed them into English, where he talks about Chametz and Matzah in different ways. The metaphor of Chametz and Matzah and how it relates to not just Pesach and Shavuot, but also just to all sorts of chagim. Uriel Etam, E-I-T-A-M. Uriel is U-R-I-E-L. And one of the things that he points out, and he takes it into a different direction than I'm going to take it, that if you are ever interested in kind of like food and the idea of purity of our soul, and as it relates to food, I think you should definitely look him up, because that's one of his subject areas. And I'm not going to be talking about that a lot, but one of the things that he does, which I thought was very interesting, is that he connects the idea of matzah and chametz to Gan Eden, to Adam and Eve before they're thrown out of Gan Eden. And one of the things that he points out is that Gan Eden is all about food, okay? It's all about the blessings of food, right? Because Adam and Eve find themselves, and if you want to go back to Breshit, you can look at the language in Perek Bet, but everything that Adam and Eve, all of the blessings that they're given are given in terms of fruits, are given in terms of this garden that has just all these fruit trees, and not very different than the fruit trees we're going to see in a second, very different than the fruit trees that we have, but there's just sustenance galore. And when we think of fruit, what do we think of food? What do we think of? We think of life, right? Food is our fuel. Food is the way that we exist as humans in this world. And Adam and Eve had an abundance of it. So in fact, the tree of life, the tree of immortality was a food. It was a food that they could eat and they could just live forever. And we don't have any evidence that they didn't eat from the tree of life. In other words, it was just, they were told they could eat from every tree except for the tree of knowledge, except for the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That everything else was purely acceptable, and there were no limits to it. And that is how they sustained themselves. Once they ate from that tree of knowledge of good and evil, all of a sudden, what happens to food? What happens to our notion of food? It no longer is a symbol of life. What is it? It's a symbol of death. Because all of a sudden, God takes away the tree of immortality. And now, because they've eaten from the wrong tree, now they are cursed with death. So that tree, that food, that idea of food becomes not a blessing of life, but a curse of mortality, a curse of being human, basically. The other aspect of that, the what happens in the Garden of Eden is that the whole notion of food becomes a curse, right? That's where we get all of our eating issues, is from Gan Eden, because the whole issue of food becomes a curse, because you're told, all of a sudden they're told, because you ate this, that's a big problem. It's going to lead you to death. And not only that, the food that is seen to be a blessing and full of complexity and full of nourishment, which is bread, all of a sudden, what is the curse? What is Adam's punishment for eating from the tree of knowledge? From that point on, you're going to have to basically work. And what does work do? We all know work leads to death, right? You're going to have to work to death to get your bread. You're going to die making bread because you have to just keep doing it every day. None of it's going to come automatically to you like it did before. You're going to die the day you stop working. The day you stop making that bread, that's going to be the end of your life. So the bread will fuel you, but you have to die in order to make it. That's going to give you mortality. So it's really interesting because Uriel Tam refers to a very, very brief line in Masechet Brachot. In Masechet Brachot, in a discussion about what kind of blessings to make, which blessings have more import than other blessings on food. It says that Rabbi Yehuda says that the tree from which Adam ate from, and there's an argument about what it is. Some people say it was a wine vine, which actually makes a lot of sense because wine leads you to no good. But Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it was wheat. He conceives it as a tree of bread, right? It's a tree of sustenance. And that was this tree of knowledge. This tree of knowledge was really the tree that gave you the sourdough starter so that you could continue to make the bread forever and ever until you die. And so it's a really interesting idea of kind of seeing Adam and Eve as a reflection of the ultimate purity, this ability of humans at that time to reach a kind of divine level of ultimate purity. And what ends up corrupting it? Bread and wheat is what ends up corrupting it. And then from then on, that's going to be the craft of humans, is making that bread. So then matzah, in its most simplest form, is the opposite. It's almost like divine bread. And we see that very interestingly in the Maharal. And the Maharal was a 16th to somewhat of the 17th century thinker, I would call him, not a philosopher. He ended up being one of the main influences for the Tanya, who would come later. Maharal was from Prague, and he kind of was an interesting synthesis between Aristotelian rational philosophical perspectives and Kabbalah and Neoplatonic and Kabbalistic mystical attitudes. He was irrational. I mean, like, he was against the rationalists, but he did very often talk in terms of the power of human reason and the power of human knowledge in order to comprehend divine ideas. And he uses some of these he will end up being very influential for the Chassidim, but he uses some of these concepts of matter and form to understand, and he applies it very interestingly to concepts that you find in the Torah. So what he says about bread in general, that's his source 4. He says, in verse 4, he's talking in Kruot Hashem in this section, he's talking about Pesach in general, and he comes to the question, which a lot of us have at the Seder, which is, why is matzah called lechem oni, right? Why is it called poor person's bread? It really shouldn't be called poor person's bread. It should be called freedom bread, right? Because the fact that it was made so quickly, b'chipazon, and it was a symbol. It became a symbol of leaving Egypt, right? It became a symbol of what was going to become the birth of our people. The birth of our people happened on the day leaving Egypt with matzah, and it also is a symbol of our connection with God. It's not just a connection it's all of a sudden we are God's people. We're leaving Egypt, and we are not pulled back by paro, by servitude. So it's freedom and liberation on many levels, and also the creation of the Jewish people. In fact, our calendar starts with the first of Nisan, right? Our calendar doesn't start with Tishrei. That's the universal calendar. Our Jewish calendar starts with Pesach. So why would you denigrate matzah by calling it poor man's bread? It should be three persons' bread. So Maharal says, "V'zeh inyam shitut." Okay, so we have to kind of get into his mode of thinking. He says, this is the essence of simplicity. You say to an Israeli, shitut, they think, stupidity, right? Like it's simple. It's like a pashta yid. It's like a simple Jew, this is so pashut, it's so simple. It's so easy to comprehend. But he thinks of it as something that is on the level of the level towards divinity, the level towards spirituality. V'zeh inyam shitut. Kasher hu omed ba'atzmo. It's a self-contained essence. V'davar zeh im shehu chisaron nechshav be'olam hazeh. Well, such in our day and age, that kind of absence, that kind of material absence of shitut. Shitut is just simple, like the most simple thing. If I say to you, you should lead a simple life, the things that you'll automatically think of as, I should get rid of my big house and get rid of my big fancy car, get rid of all the materialistic things and just simplify my life, right? Simplify my life. But often people will think of that as a chisaron. Like, then what do you have if you get rid of all those amazing things? That's only considered a chisaron, according to Maharal, in Olam Hazeh, in this world. Shehu Olam Harkava. This is the world of composition. This is the world where matter matters. So matter for Homer, for Maharal, that's corporeality. That's what makes for the way he interprets it, and using kind of a Neoplatonic perspective, is that's not what's going to last. That's not spiritual. That's not divine. It's what makes us humans. So we are a composite of different materials. We are from this olam harkava, this world of composition. Okay, uma'ato harkava, where excellence is found in complexity. Okay, uma'ato harkava, like as humans, anything that's complex, anything where you need an engineer, or you need a baker, or you need someone who's going to put ingredients together and make something fancy. Wow, that's impressive. That's what impresses human beings. Simplicity is nonetheless a supreme virtue from the perspective of the simple world. And that has no kind of complexity. Okay. The reason why it's a mitzvah to eat matzah is that it's an entree into this pashut, into this pure, uncomplicated world. We come from the complicated world. Matzah brings us back to simplicity. Because they had to leave in a big hurry. They had to leave b'chipazon, bli hamshech zman, without any kind of duration of time. Okay, and I want you to focus on that notion of time. That means that when they left that kind of complexity of time, they had to leave in a hurry. They had to leave this instant. They were entering into another higher spiritual level. For an action that's transcendent beyond time. Not like the things, the natural phenomena that we have in our world, where everything is anchored in time. So what is he saying about time here? What is he saying about matzah? What is he saying about time and this kind of simplistic world of simplicity? When Bnei Israel left Egypt, they were leaving a human realm and going into a divine realm. And that's what B'chipazon is. what is Zman for Maharal? Zman for Maharal is human created. It's a human notion. It's a complex from the Olam Harkava. It's something that comes from this world of complexity. And we think of the world of complexity as something really sophisticated. But he's saying it's only sophisticated from a human point of view. The divine spiritual realm is absolutely, there's no complexity. It's a flat line. And when it's a flat line, that means it's timeless. So when you say you got to get out of there in Egypt, out of Egypt, the Bnei Israel, it wasn't just that they had to go in a hurry and they're running. They leave the realm of human time. In one instance, they're slaves. In the next instant, they're free. In one instant, they're in servitude to a king of flesh and blood. And the next one, they have a brit with the divine. And so it's not a matter of human time, it's a matter of divine moment, a divine moment. And matzah becomes a symbol of that. Matzah and its most, what is it? Matzah and chametz, they're absolutely the same thing. It's flour and water. It's just that what does chametz have as opposed to matzah? Time. It has time. What does matzah have? No time. There's a time limitation. There's a choser zman with matzah, right? The moment you start making it, you're already going backwards in time and hoping that the process is going to be done right now because you don't have human time. You're in a realm of choser time. Choser zman, not choser time, also choser time. But you're in this liminal space that is no longer part of a human understanding of time and progression. And that's the only way you can go. That's the only way Bnei Israel can go from servitude and from the lowliest point of view that they are in, where they don't own time, right? None of their time is their own. That's the only way they can go from that human malkoret, like that human prison, to a spiritual realm, And so the idea of matzah kind of lends itself to that understanding. Then what is the first mitzvah that Bnei Israel get once they leave Egypt? Rosh Chodesh, right? And what is Rosh Chodesh? Time. So all of a sudden they leave Egypt, and the first mitzvah they get brings them back to this notion of time. What is the next mitzvah that they get when they it's not the next mitzvah that they get, but what is Omer? What is the Omer that leads to Shavuot? It's time, it's counting, right? You have to keep sorry, someone is not muted. So if you can mute yourself, that'd be great, because I don't see you here. But this idea of Omer, again, counting, it's human. It's part of this Olam Harkava. They're leaving that spiritual realm and moment by moment going into this human realm. So then the question is, why? Why, if when you think it should be the opposite, shouldn't Pesach be the time? Shouldn't Pesach be the moment when they transition out of that human realm into the divine realm and the divine notion where time no longer makes sense? Shouldn't it be a progression from that moment to Shavuot, to receiving the Torah? Shouldn't that be the complexity of this situation? Why is it going backwards? Why are we starting with this simplicity and divine realm and moving up towards humanity, towards a human notion of time? So it's a good question. And
maybe that's what sanctifies the time.
So maybe that's what sanctifies. So explain, Esty, what you mean.
No, I'm just, when you're thinking about moving up and becoming more holy, and then time becomes part of that experience.
That time. Well, okay. So then, so in other words, for you to be able to comprehend it as a human, you need to now put it into something that's understandable. I like that. Yeah, sorry, you've been patient.
No, if a lot of this has to do with sustenance and nourishment. So we started with a basic essence of flour and water without the leavening. Then we ran out of our supplies, and God had to sustain us with man. So then our dependence shifted. Well, our dependence was wholly, and our survival was wholly in God's hands until we came out of Egypt. And then ultimately we're able to sustain ourselves through his blessing of bread.
And I think that is a very nice way of understanding it based on what Esty mentioned before, which is that if you think of the harvest and you think of the agricultural aspect of Shavuot, this transition makes perfect sense, right? Because that celebration is only going to happen when they get into Eretz Yisrael. And so throughout the Midbar, throughout their journey through the wilderness, then they're being sustained by God. But then what is Shavuot? What is the critical aspect of Shavuot? Bikurim. It's bringing the fruits of your harvest with a recognition of what? With a cognition and an understanding that this is all our Bikurim. These are our first fruits that are all divine blessings. So they may not be as obvious as the man. It won't be as obvious as the nourishment, the spiritual and pashut nourishment that they received in the desert, but it's an acknowledgement that even through this hard toil, like Adam now has to work for his bread, and this toil that's going to come from your own hands is still that blessing. It's a cognition that it's still part of the same covenant, which also is a nice way of looking back. If we go back to the Adam and Eve idea, that journey in the desert is really where Bnei Israel, and Uriel Eicham talks about that as well, that's where Bnei Israel is really going through a journey back to Eden. So not to point a phrase, but it's a journey back to a level of perfection that, of course, they were missing in Egypt, but that humanity was missing in general. And that was the only way, according to his analysis, that was the only way that they could receive the Torah, is if they go back to Eden in that way. So that's a really nice way of looking at it. And I think it makes sense as far as any of this makes sense. It makes sense in terms of the context here. So, I forgot to copy this part of the source sheet because it was Erev Shabbat. That's just what happened. But this is another interesting, and I never talk about Hasidim, but this is from a source from the Pri Tzaddik, of Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, who had a very interesting life. He lived in the 19th century. I forget where he was from originally, somewhere in Lithuania. And what's interesting is he was a Litvak through and through, like 100% Litvak. And he had some sort of spiritual crisis in his life and ended up moving to Poland, if you can imagine, and becoming a student, I forget of whom, but he aligned himself with the Hasidism movement and became kind of a Hasid. And so he's really interesting because he had a lot of, obviously Talmudic learning, but also more broadly, he had more of a broad notion of Jewish philosophy and understanding, and kind of overlaid it with a more mystical Hasidic view of the world. And he talks a lot about, like, the little bits that I've seen, and I haven't ever studied him, for Retzef, but in the little passages I've seen from him, he does a very interesting thing where he likes to incorporate, again, talking about the limits of human reason and how Jews can partner with God, how it's possible for Jews with limits in reason can partner with divine reason. And so he says something very interesting in the Pri Tzaddik, and I have the source if anybody wants it. And now he's talking about Shavuot. And he says about Shavuot something really interesting. And he brings up this question. In other words, why is it, he doesn't bring up the Chametz question per se, but he talks about what is happening on Shavuot that's different than what happens on Pesach. And so we talked about it already, and a lot of people have commented on this idea. Pesach is despite everything that we're saying about purity and about this connection with the divine, connection with God, and this high level of spirituality, and this pashut that Maharal talks about, this no nonsense, strip away everything else. It's just God and Bnei Israel, like back in Eden. Despite all that, what is essentially an essential aspect of Pesach? It's very passive. It's very passive, right? Everything happens to Bnei Israel. All they really do is yell and scream and then complain the moment that they get out. They're not accepting anything. There isn't anything of they follow the Korban Pesach and they follow the rules, but other than that, it's all very passive. God is just sort of plucking them out of Egypt and taking them out and putting them in the midbar, and of course there are miracles and they watch everything that's happening, but it's not a choice. We do know from some midrashim that some Jews stayed behind because they loved the watermelon and the zucchini or whatever but other than, and then some Egyptians came on the way, so it's not clear exactly what was happening, but it wasn't really a choice. Okay, what's different with Shavuot? And if we think of Shavuot as celebrating Matan Torah is, Chazal calls it Naaseh v'Nishma, right? It's active. The Jewish people will do, and we will do it, and we will follow. We will listen, and that is a very active mode of acceptance. It's not that, and of course we have the midrashim that God threatened Bnei Israel with a mountain over their head, with Har Sinai over their head, and said, "I will drop this on you." And they said, "Okay, we'll take it." So, but still, even with that midrash, it's highlighting an acceptance, a kabbalat ol malchut shamayim, an acceptance of the kingship, the kingdom of God. Whereas you don't have that with Pesach. You don't have that kind of acceptance. So we definitely see this kind of elevation that happens in the mentality of Bnei Israel that happens between Pesach and Shavuot. But Rav Tzadok raises something very interesting, and he says, "V'nir'eh mizeh she'inyan haTorah shel laila zo nigmar al yedei Torah sheba'al peh." That it appears that this process of purification on this night of Shavuot is completed through the oral law. It's completed through the oral law. So we always say, it's the day of Matan Torah, it's the day of the giving of the Torah. A lot of people focus on the 10 Commandments. We read the 10 Commandments in Shul, and that's how it's described in the Torah. Is this, and then later we said no, it wasn't just the 10 Commandments, but Bnei Israel, they're giving up the whole law. And then of course we have the rabbinical perspective. If we go back to the first Mishnah and Pirkei Avot, the idea that Moshe not only received the Torah, but received the written Torah, or the whatever we call the written Torah, but also received what? The oral law, the Torah sheba'al peh, and that they are one, and they are two sides in the same coin. Torah shebechtah, the written Torah, and Torah sheba'al peh, the oral Torah. What's the difference between the two? What's the difference between the written Torah and Torah sheba'al peh? What is the difference? One is set. What is the other one? The other one is in our hands, right? And like Rosh Chodesh, here's Pesach. You don't have a choice about this, right? But what do you have a choice with? Rosh Chodesh. How are you going to mark Rosh Chodesh? You're going to do it based on the fact that you are a human being. What is different between you and the divine? You have eyes. You watch the moon. You have limited senses as opposed to the divine, but you're able to count a month from one phase of the moon to the next phase of the moon, and from the old moon to the new moon. And you can rely on each other to be witnesses to that. And you can rely on each other to create a court system and to create a legal system whereby you are able to declare the new moon every month and also declare the days of the holidays. And so all of that is Torah sheba'al peh. All of that is part of our oral tradition. It's the realm, it's the area of human reason. So what does Rav Tzadok say here? He says that aspect of purity that comes from Shavuot is actually the night. It actually is commemorated within the receiving of the oral tradition. In other words, with the oral tradition, with the Torah is the Torah. We're not inside that Torah. We can listen to the Torah, but we're not inside of it. But Torah Shabbat Peh, that's us. That's us in communication with God. That's us joining that divine conversation. Ve'ohalim shel Torah kavanato b'yukud al Torah Shabbat Peh she'eno nipneh be'adam ad shekol ha'olam hazeh hu ke'ohel ar etzlo. And the tense of Torah refers specifically to the oral Torah, which a person cannot truly acquire until this entire world becomes like a temporary tent to them. This is in the sources I sent you on the phone, by the way. I did send it. I just didn't print it. I like that reference to the temporary tent because what does that remind you of? Sukkot, right? And we said that there's a balance between all of these chagim, but specifically Shavuot is considered to be the Shmini Atzeret of Pesach. You know, that idea of being in that temporary place, that's a very human place. You're part of the Ohel of Torah, but it's temporary. It's human. It's our human bridge to the divine. V'hineh b'shana rishona la'achar yitziat Mitzrayim hayu mechinim et atzmam lekabbalat haTorah b'chol hachanot la'azov kol inyanei olam hazeh omnan b'chayei Torah Shabbat Peh b'poel b'foal lo haya lahem od. Now, in the first year after the exodus from Egypt, the people were preparing themselves to receive the Torah with all the necessary preparations, leaving behind all worldly matters. However, the actual experience of the oral Torah was not yet within their reach. They still had to go through a process. So they could go through a process of purification. They could go through a process where they could reach that divine level or God could give them the means for reaching this divine level of Pesach. And matzah is a reflection of that. Matzah is that most simple, least complex idea of flour and water resembles that kind of divine purification they had to go to in order to get out of Egypt. They had to forget about time. They had to forget about servitude. They had to be back to the most basic principles of sustainment so that they could retract back to this kind of Eden. And then they had to spend the time of the desert going through this process until they could reach a time of Chametz. And Chametz, if we go back to it, Chametz is complex. Chametz is Torah and Torah Shabbat Peh. And so according to Rav Tzadok, you don't have that communication. You cannot accept the Torah until you are a part of it. And the only way to be a part of it is to have the chametz with you, is to have the bread and to acknowledge that this is part of your contribution to that process. You know that there's a more pure way of looking at it, and that's the matzah that you just left 50 days ago. But this whole process of Omer, of collecting the wheat and then bringing it as bikurim, bringing it as bread, is a reflection of this notion that you're embracing your humanity, you're embracing your complexity, and you're bringing your human reason to bear through the means of the oral tradition, through being a part of that conversation and that conversation with each other and that conversation with God around how all of this is going to work. They weren't there at Pesach. So at Pesach, and with the man and with the desert, God could help them in that purification process. But Shavuot is the culmination of it. Shavuot is the culmination of being able to say, we can contribute in that way. So I think that kind of, I think that that's a really interesting way of seeing how, in fact, Chametz, on the one hand, the day of Pesach, we think of Chametz as the worst trait in the world. And on Shavuot, we celebrate it. And we acknowledge that this is a part of ourselves that we're bringing with recognition of where we were and where we want to go. So Chag Sameach, everyone. If anybody has questions, I'm happy to answer questions, or if you have points that you want to make. Otherwise, yes.
You want to why it's for them money?
Why is it so? Maharal
Source for the simple bread.
Right, exactly. So in the paragraph before, Maharal talks about how poverty is a way for people to actually get back to that hashut, to that olam hashut that he describes. Okay, thank you everyone. Chag Sameach, and thank you for joining the Yom Iyun today. And I'll end this meeting. Goodbye.
Thank you.